Hello and welcome back to Beyond Boxes. This is a podcast episode, which means you can listen on Spotify, iTunes, or wherever you listen to your podcasts, or you can watch the full interview right here on YouTube. Today, I am thrilled to be joined by Mel Cassidy. Welcome, Mel.
Hi, thanks for having me on your podcast, Jaya.
Thanks for joining me today. Before we get started, can you let us know which labels, if any, you identify with?
How long do we have? So I describe myself as queer, and I use that label because it's wonderfully ambiguous. So I am both queer in my orientation and queer in my gender experience. I am a relationship anarchist. I practice polyamory. I label myself as white presenting, although that's not the total of my ethnic background and the lineage and ancestry that I hold. I am an immigrant. I am, oh my gosh, I could keep going. There's a lot of different identifiers. But I think the queer, the relationship anarchist, those are probably two of the more important ones these days. And I would say that as well, when it comes to like gender, I'm queer in gender, but femme in my expression of it.
Interesting. And your pronouns?
I use either they, them, or she, her.
Fantastic. So Mel Cassidy is a relationship coach and the creator of the Monogamy Detox course. So you used some terminology which some people might not be familiar with. So I've defined queer before, both on this podcast and in my YouTube channel, as sort of an umbrella term for anyone who isn't cis, which means the opposite of trans, and straight, or heterosexual, which I always struggle to say the word. I'm so unfamiliar with saying hetero these days. So yeah, queer is an umbrella term for the LGBTQIAP+ community. But you also talked about relationship anarchy, non-monogamy. So let's start by defining some of those terms.
Yeah, so relationship anarchy is, I think arguably it's probably the most queer form of relating, if we're using queer as the like against the norm.
Mm-hmm.
So relationship anarchy kind of throws out the idea of labels a lot. And it says rather than going by a prescribed path of expectations and limitations because of the way that you want to label yourself or the expectations that society has of you, what if you create your own path? What if you're working on what feels authentic for you? And for some people, they hear that and they're like, well, that makes perfect sense. For some people, they hear that and they feel a little bit terrified. But relationship anarchy as a term, it was first coined by a person in Sweden called Andy Nordgren, and it has really grown from there. You know, there's an original manifesto, but people have done lots of exploration of what it can be. But for me, it's really about not conforming to expectations. And so living outside the boxes that society wants us to conform into. And one of the things with relationship anarchy is people are a little more hesitant to label their relationships in RA, call it RA for short. I like to embrace the approach of having labels that are descriptive rather than prescriptive. So rather than going into a relationship and saying like, oh, you're really cool, I want you to be this person for me. And then we're going to try and figure out how you be that person for me and I be some kind of person for you. We move into a connection and we explore what that connection is. And then maybe down the line, we're like, oh, hey, there's a word that describes this. And let's use that as a shorthand to describe what this is.
And sometimes yeah, I love that. And sometimes there isn't just one word, right? Sometimes it requires a whole sentence, or sometimes it's a couple of words. And I really, really like that distinguishing like a descriptive rather than prescriptive. Is that what you said? Yeah, that's fantastic.
Yeah. And I've found it so liberating. I mean, labels and terms are so useful for us because it creates a shorthand. You know, it helps us find other people who might be like us when we're searching for online communities or in-person spaces. And yet labels can be really limiting and confusing because the same word can mean 100 different things. Like we look at the word queer, it can mean so many different things. And so I've really enjoyed in my own relationships and in my coaching work that I do, getting outside of the labels and just going like, well, what does that mean for you? Let's describe it before we figure out a label for it.
Yeah. And I think, you know, umbrella labels can be really useful in that sense. So queer is a fantastic label. It's, you know, it means you sense that you're part of an alternative community, people who are doing things outside the norm in terms of their gender, their sexual orientation, their sexual expression. But it's, you know, but it can mean so many different things. And people know that within the queer community know that it means different things. So then you can sort of question what that means to a person, but you have that kind of almost like that kinship feeling. And I think, you know, non-monogamy can be similar. So like, let's talk a bit about, because, you know, there's different language gets thrown around these days. We hear consensual non-monogamy, ethical non-monogamy, polyamory, relationship anarchy. And I think people who aren't in that world can feel a bit overwhelmed and confused by all the terminology. So
Yes.
maybe we can start by explaining some of the terminology. You've talked about relationship anarchy already, but like why consensual non-monogamy, why ethical non-monogamy, what's polyamory, and which are the umbrella terms? How do things fit within that?
So yeah, non-monogamy is this umbrella term. And I like to think of it as, okay, we have monogamy on this one side, and we all have a fairly good sense of what that might include and what that usually implies. But non-monogamy is anything that is not that. And within non-monogamy, I kind of visualize it like a flow chart. You have a choice of doing it honestly or dishonestly.
Right.
So there is a dishonest form of non-monogamy, which we better know as cheating. And I like to really emphasize that because there are a lot of people who will say like, oh, I'm polyamorous, but my wife just doesn't know, or, you know, I want to have multiple partners and not tell them all about each other. That classifies as cheating because there is dishonesty involved. So when we move into the honest aspects of non-monogamy, there are so many possibilities. And, you know, a lot of terms get thrown around. I think some get misunderstood. Polyamory often gets used as the umbrella term instead of non-monogamy, and I think that's confusing. Polyamory as a term generally refers to multiple intimate romantic relationships with the full knowledge and consent of all of those involved. And the key thing with polyamory is that you're having intimacy, you're having emotional intimacy, you're having that rapport and that connection. And so there are some people who come across the word polyamory because they're exploring the swinging scene or they're in the kink scene. And they're like, wow, this word sounds really good. And there's a lot of articles about it. And it kind of feels a little more legitimate than swinging, which there's a whole bunch of stigma around. And so people have adopted that label, but then they're like, no, I'm actually not open to having emotional relationships outside of this one partner that I have. And I think that's one of the places where things get confusing and kind of sticky. I'm a big fan of let's just call a spade and let's unpack the shaming and sex negativity around swinging, because I think swinging is a wonderful form of non-monogamy. So in swinging, that's saying that you're having sexual relationships. There might be, you know, friendships and social and emotional components to those relationships too, but you're not dating those people. You're not developing a romantic or intimate relationship with them in the same way that you might with an emotional partner. And so there's nothing wrong with that. It can be super wonderful. So swinging is another form of honest non-monogamy. You know, there's forms of honest non-monogamy that are egalitarian, where people are trying to like, I'm going to have all these partners, I'm going to try and treat them all equally and give them equal amount of time and equal amount of attention. You might have people in, you know, committed 4 or 5 people relationships. That I'm like, I don't know how people do that. That's still something that I'm like, when people have done that, I'm like, wow, that is incredible. There's so much complexity going on in multi-people relationships when it's just those people, and they're all in relationship with each other. And then there's hierarchical relationships. And this is what we tend to see more often because we're used to having a level of hierarchy in monogamy, right? And in classical monogamy, you have your person, your partner, and they become prioritized. And for not everybody, but for most people, like friendships and other connections kind of drop to the wayside. They're not, there isn't as much space to prioritize them as there is to prioritize your partner. And so that kind of sense of hierarchy gets carried over into some people's exploration of non-monogamy. There is again, with hierarchy, there's prescriptive hierarchy where it's like, no, you have to treat me as number one, no matter what. And there's also a descriptive hierarchy where it's kind of like, well, I have a priority because, you know, this person is my co-parent. And so our priority is our child. And so there's like responsibilities there. And I think there's nothing wrong with having a descriptive hierarchy, a kind of hierarchy based on the relational needs involved. And then there's anarchy. And, you know, it kind of goes back to the relationship anarchy idea. A lot of people get scared when they hear the word anarchy because they think it's going to mean chaos and a lack of order. But, you know, I like to think of it because the word anarchy comes from the Greek word anarchos, which means to be without rule. And that is about saying, I'm not going to let someone else dictate the terms to me of how I behave and what I do. I am exploring being my own ruler and having my own agency. And so in a more anarchic configuration in non-monogamy, the configurations might change. It might be fluid. It might require a lot more communication. And so maybe that is that sense of chaos that some people fear. But for the people for whom that works, it's really rewarding. And it allows a lot of diversity and exploration. So that's a kind of like overview of these different forms. And there's others I haven't really gone into there, but I wanted to touch on this idea of consensual non-monogamy and ethical non-monogamy. So the consensual non-monogamy, so that implies that it is done with the consent of all involved. And consent is such a fascinating topic. Like I've been teaching about consent for about 7 years now, and I keep unpacking more layers of nuance into understanding consent culture. And, you know, one of the key things with consent is that you have to have a full awareness of what you're getting involved in. And I think it's really tricky for us to have that when we're talking about non-monogamy. You know, if I'm engaging in a new relationship with somebody and they've got, you know, a certain relationship configuration at that point in time, how much do I get to know about all of that beforehand? And there's always that space of there's things I don't know that I want to know, especially when this is a new form of relating. Maybe I've never thought to ask about, well, what are your sexual health and safety practices with your other partners? You know, and maybe that ends up being something that, oh, after the fact, I realized I wanted to know. Does that mean that the consent of that relationship is called into question? So there's a lot of kind of sticky areas there. I do use the term consensual non-monogamy because I think, like the honesty piece, it's at least supporting the idea that we're not doing this without the knowledge of other people, that we're not kind of sneaking around and going behind closed doors and kind of sitting in the space of shadow with it. So I do like using the term consensual non-monogamy. The term ethical non-monogamy is, I think, a really an interesting one. And it's one that I prefer not to use because ethics are culturally subjective. Right. And, you know, I lived in the Middle East for years, and in the Middle East, you know, the ethical way to do non-monogamy in a lot of in Middle Eastern cultures, at least traditionally, was you have one man and he can marry multiple women. That is the ethical way to approach having non-monogamous relationships. And it's culturally entrenched, and there's religious support for that. And there's a whole bunch of other, you know, cultural codes that support how you're supposed to have ethical relationships. We come to the West, and what are our ethics? What are the ethics based upon? and so much of the time when people are talking about ethical non-monogamy, the ethics that they're based upon tend to be the ethics of white supremacy. So there's a kind of internalized sense of you're supposed to do things a certain way, and we're going to dictate to you what the right way to do something is and the wrong way to do something is. And that whole binary thinking, if there is right and wrong, is, I've learned, very much part of that white supremacy ideology, and very watered down for some of us by this point. But when you step out of that Western white supremacy thinking, and you start looking at Eastern thought and non-colonized cultures, you see that there is a lot more space for holding the ambiguity of things and the nuances, and that two seemingly opposing ideas can coexist. So for me, I prefer looking at it as honest non-monogamy rather than ethical, because I don't really feel like it's useful for us to talk about it as ethics. I think you can talk about your own moral code. I think you can talk about your own values and your own boundaries and what works for you, and have amazing conversations about what works for other people. But if we're just using this word of ethics and then never questioning whose ethics are we following, what does that mean, then we're just going to run into so many problems, because everybody's got a different sense of what the ethical thing to do is. Does that make sense?
It does. And it's fascinating. And I really appreciate you bringing that in, because it's not even something that I'd really thought about in that way, And I like to think I spend a lot of time thinking about these topics and about labels and identity in general, and white supremacy and privilege and power dynamics in society. But it's true that, yeah, what does ethical mean? And when you're talking about different cultures, it can mean such different things. And I love the term honest non-monogamy. And
Yeah.
there's, in everything you've just shared, what's really being highlighted, and some really essential points you've made, is there are so many different ways of doing non-monogamy. And within each of those ways, there are so many different, ways of doing it. So within each of those labels, each of those categories, there's so many different ways. And that's why it's so essential when you're going outside of the norm and outside of a prescriptive pattern to start using more descriptive language around labels, I think, as you're saying, rather than, I think that's where sometimes it can be a little tricky. We're so used to having a set of rules that we can move away from one set of rules and straight into another. And Meg-John Barker talks a lot about this, that's where the whole concept of rewriting the rules, the book and the blog comes from, right?
Yeah, we leave one box and just put ourselves in another box because we don't know how to survive without a box. Our nervous system completely freaks out without a box to be in. And so we just put ourselves in a new box.
100%. And that's why this is called Beyond Boxes. It's about figuring out what that means beyond boxes. And at the same time, as you say, labels, especially identity labels, social labels, can be really, really supportive in finding community, in having, a framework, because when you're doing something and you're not in a box, or you're trying to go beyond the boxes, it can feel really overwhelming at times as well. So having a framework, having a sense of community, of peer support, all these things are some of the pros of labels. And the only people I know who are 100% anti-labels tend to be straight cis white men, where they don't, this constantly having life reflected back at them, so they don't need that. So they automatically have that sense of community, of being reflected, of mirroring, of all this kind of stuff. So absolutely. I think that it's important to highlight those points, that there are pros and cons to labels, but that they can be important. But I love this idea of going more to a descriptive rather than prescriptive angle. And I know for myself, that's why I struggled when I first joined the non-monogamous scene, which was very much the polyamorous community where I was in at the time of my life. And I was very much identified as being polyamorous for a few years, but I ended up hitting some, having my struggles with that term, that label, because I felt like people were doing it in a way that wasn't working for me, where it was becoming just as prescriptive, just different prescription and different set of rules than the standard monogamy.
Well, and the media has kind of contributed to that. I call it the polynormative model, right?
Right.
Where it's like, well, you have to have a primary partner and then you date secondaries, or maybe you have a primary partner and you date together. And it doesn't work for everybody. And I remember when I started exploring polyamory in earnest, in my right as I turned 30, I was so confused by this because I was like going to polyamory meetups, and I had just moved into Vancouver, which is this kind of like polyamorous hotspot in the world. And I felt like there was so much pressure on me that either I was going to be this secondary or third, this unicorn kind of person because I didn't have a primary partner, or I must be looking for a primary partner.
Yeah.
And, until I had that, I was, keep approach with caution. And it was really perplexing to me. And I feel lucky that, I came in with my desire to be more solo. So, the way that I practice my polyamory, I describe it as solo polyamory, which means that I'm not looking for a primary partner. I am my own primary partner. And at that same time, there was a sort of movement of people starting to look at it and question this sort of couple-centric form of polyamory and going more into that relationship anarchy approach. And so it's changed a lot, in the past decade. I've seen the shape of the polyamorous community shift, and the sorts of conversations are changing. And I think, we've managed to get out of the defaulting to there's got to be this one right way to do it, and it's very rigid. And there's a lot more space and resources and tools to be able to look at, well, what's going to really work for you? What's going to be the kindest thing for you and the kindest thing for the other people involved? And it's been remarkable to see that shift happen. And I think there's still more that we can do to shift that. But the poly community itself has, I still see areas where it's very like, there are pockets where people are very kind of rigid. And as you said, like they've gone from one box into another box of their own making and haven't been able to go through that process of questioning everything. And I think that's simply from a lack of support and permission to be able to question things, right? If we are removing that safety blanket of monogamy, we need to have at least some kind of like temporary place of safety while we rebuild a new form for ourselves to be in. So we need to have, we get used to our primary partner being a secure attachment point, and the idea of finding a secure attachment partner is very compelling. And if we are stepping out of the monogamous construct of that, we have to have something for our nervous system to hold on to. Otherwise, we freak out and we go right back into holding on to some other thing just as desperately as we used to hold on to monogamy. Does that make sense?
It does. And I think it's a really important point to make. And I think, often these kind of leaving the boxes, going beyond with the boxes is a journey, right? And it's not something you can just do overnight. And I think people sometimes forget that and feel like they're just going to like jump out of all the norms and suddenly be free. And, and again, like I love the fact that you were defining anarchic, because it's not so much about chaos, it's about creating your, like ruling yourself and going by your own set of rules rather than society's set of rules. But cultural conditioning and society's rules are so impregnated in us in every, like in all different layers of our consciousness, that it's not something you can just rip off overnight,
It isn't. I tell my clients and my students all the time, I wish there was a magic wand that I could just wave and we could undo all of this programming from patriarchal monogamy and all of this stuff within, a short span of time. But realistically, it takes a long time and there's layers. And I've been doing this for years now, and I'm still running up against layers in myself. I feel really lucky that I now have the tools to be able to recognize them when they're there and go, aha, I know what you are. You're part of that internalized programming that I've had since I was a child, and Disney movies and
yes, damn
and
Disney
magazines and all of that stuff. And I'm like, okay, I know what to do with this now. But when I first started, I had no idea. I was like, what am I doing? What do I even want? Am I going to ruin my life by pursuing this? There were so many deep questions. And yeah, I think having the support to question things is so important, so vital.
So tell us a bit more about your personal journey with polyamory or non-monogamy, or honest non-monogamy. That's the term we're using today. So tell me more about your personal journey with honest non-monogamy.
I can look back at my childhood and see how the seeds for it were already there. Because people ask, like, is it an orientation or not? And I'm like, I think non-monogamy might be. I know the Kinsey Institute has been doing research into this, but anecdotally, I think, some people are more wired for multiple partnerships, and some people might be more wired for fewer or more exclusive partnerships. But as a kid, in my make-believe stories as a little girl, I had 3 husbands.
Oh, wow. Okay.
And it wasn't until my mom told me you're not allowed to do that I realized there was anything wrong with that. But even in high school, my sort of first boyfriend in high school, in our last year, we weren't together, but we would kind of get together and make out behind the school theater during spare classes. But he started dating somebody at another school. And I was like, well, do you want to stop doing what we're doing? And he's like, not really. And I'm like, well, do you want to tell her about me? I'm fine with that. And he's like, no, I don't want to do that. And I was like, okay. So it wasn't an honest form of non-monogamy, but it was definitely an experience of non-monogamy. And what's interesting is, like, he and I reconnected years later. And of course, both of us have continued to explore non-monogamy as adults. But it was this really, so I can look back at it and see, like, there was the seeds for that. But when I was 21, I had just graduated from university. I wasn't sure what I was doing with my life. And I was still on that kind of default of, I have to be a successful grown-up. And what's the next thing you do after you've graduated from university, right? One of the next steps is get married. And so when my partner at the time proposed to me, I was like, sure, okay, I guess that's what you're supposed to do. And I knew that I had attraction to multiple genders. I knew that I wanted to explore more with other men. And I told him that. And he was like, well, women, great. That sounds awesome. Men, I don't know. We'll cross that bridge when we come to it. And, through our marriage, it was a conversation that would come up every so often. And then eventually, 5 or 6 years into the marriage, we did have a threesome experience with somebody else. And that really opened my eyes. I was like, oh, this is what's possible. Like, I remember coming out of that and feeling my body in a completely different way. And this person that we had this experience with, she was amazing. She and I talked more afterwards, and I was describing to her what I wanted. And she's like, oh, that sounds like polyamory. And suddenly I had this term that I could Google and I could research, and I started Googling, and I started finding live journal blogs and YouTube videos, and it was very overwhelming. I was like, what is this? And then I started to go from there. And, in my marriage, I first of all tried doing the dishonest non-monogamy. And I had a relationship that I didn't tell my husband about, but that kind of, it taught me that I didn't want to do that. I couldn't live with that dishonesty. It was making me sick to do that. And so I realized I had to change things in my life. So my husband and I separated quite amicably, and later divorced. And I began exploring non-monogamy. And my journey, when we talk about all these different types of non-monogamy that there are, I feel like I've gotten to dip my toes into that, at least, in every single form. So I've been part of that couple who seeks out a third. I've also been that third who goes and connects with other couples. That was like my early experiences. I've been that person who's sought out a primary partner. I then realized, like, actually, I think I just want to be my own primary partner. And so back in 2012, when I made the move into Vancouver, which was then my home for 6 years, it was this really clear thing for me. If I'm my own primary partner and I'm having an orgy with the universe, and I'm just going to see what this is like. I'm going to give it 2 years doing this and then reassess. And at the end of those 2 years, I was like, you know what, I really like this. And maybe I want to make some changes and explore some other things. But that has stayed more or less the same pattern for me. And, I had an experience where I met somebody that I was like, wow, this feels like you could actually be a life partner. I could live with you. And so there was a whole journey to explore what would it be like to have a life partner and not be on that default of what we call the relationship escalator, that inevitable trajectory. What would it be like to live with somebody and not fall into those habits of patriarchal monogamy around being a couple and all of that. And even though that relationship didn't end up working out, it was a really useful exploration for me in terms of, oh, I think I could do that maybe one day with the right compatibilities in place. But at the same time, I love living alone, and I love having that freedom, and I love having the diversity in my life of different partners. And, I have the pandemic has definitely shifted things, as I know it's shifted most people's relationships. But, I've had long distance partners, and I love that because I can go visit them and we spend an intense time together and really get to drop in deep. Maybe I only see them once a year, and that's great. And then, I've had local partners, I've had relationships that have been like 1, 2, 3 years. A lot of them are, even when we have ended the romantic part of the relationship, we stay really close as friends. I have one ex-partner that I can go stay at his apartment and we snuggle naked. There's not a sexual dynamic there, but there's that comfort. And I think for me, like when I talk about finding that's, how else are you creating that security for yourself? For me, it's been creating that community of intimate connections has been so important. And that there's a kind of continuity, even when the romantic relationship shifts, a lot of these people are still part of my life. And I enjoy rich friendships with them. And it's just really lovely to see. And also to be exploring without an agenda of it has to go a certain way. I've got a vision for what I want this to look like in 10 years, but is it going to? I don't know. I know that what's more important for me is that I'm exploring according to my values.
I think that's so key, that exploring your values, like, creating all your experiences from your values. You can't go too wrong from doing that way. And I think, what you're talking about is really resonating in the sense that it's like what we were talking about earlier. You need to be on your own journey and figure stuff out for yourself. You needed to go through all the steps you went through to get to where you are today. And you're going to go through a whole bunch. Who knows what, like you said, you have an idea of what your life could look like in 10 years, but who knows what it will actually look like. But you need those ideas and you need your experiences to get you to wherever you'll go next and to get you to where you've got to today.
Yeah. And, I went through a kind of dark night of things in my poly experiences for a few years where it just felt like there was a huge weight on me. It was like just being stuck in a swamp of feelings. And I was processing trauma, and there was a lot of drama within relationship stuff that I was involved in and around me. And I like to think of it as, it was what I got from that. I got the post-traumatic growth. So, I wouldn't wish those kinds of experiences on anyone. However, something in there shifted within me in order to meet those circumstances. And it helped me to actually figure out stuff about myself that I don't know I ever would have figured out if that hadn't happened. There's stuff that childhood stuff that we kind of just push aside, and or aspects of ourselves that we never think we can explore. And something about the pressure cooker of some of the rough patches in my non-monogamy journey kind of encouraged me to actually okay, let's do this. Let's explore that childhood trauma. Let's go get therapy. Let's get outside of the box of thinking and try something completely different. So, I don't want it to sound like it's all been a parade of rainbows and
No, but it's been your journey. And I think, that's always what I'm trying to explain to people, that there is no, you and I are talking about non-monogamy today, but that's not a universal experience of non-monogamy. This is your experience. And then I might throw in a few of my experiences in
Yes.
there, and when I talk to Meg-John about their experience of being non-binary, for example, that's their experience. That's not the universal. And that's again what we talked about on that episode. And same with, all the other people I've spoken to on this podcast and through the interviews I do, and just in life in general. I love talking to people and I love hearing people's different stories. But again, we go beyond boxes. We don't have one universal way that monogamy is meant to look like. And for you, it's been really supportive in, for example, working with trauma. And we talk a lot about that on the Trauma Super Conference, which people can check out either by Googling or by checking the link on my website or your website. But yeah, so I think, and and again, whilst we're talking about labels, I think it's really important to remember, for example, when you're talking about your early experiences of non-monogamy, and when you and your husband at the time had that threesome and you were describing, what you wanted, and the person then had a label, which then enabled you to Google and find that community and find that peer support. Whereas if you just sort of descriptive relationships or descriptive labels rather than prescriptive are great in some ways. And also sometimes, you have to sometimes go the other way. Like if you just Google, like, I want lots of love experiences, it might not always yield exactly what you're looking for.
Exactly. And, this is the way that social media works, right? We want these terms, we want these hashtags. And I remember when, I started writing a blog in 2012 called Polysinglish, because I was like, this is the best way I can describe who I am. If Shakespeare can invent words, then so the hell can I. And so I started writing that. And then someone sent me an article from the Solo Poly blog, and I was like, oh, this is describing the same thing. And so we ended up starting a Facebook group for solo polyamory. And because that's a term and it catches people's attention, especially people who are kind of wandering through the polyamorous realm and the non-monogamy worlds, going like, well, what if I don't want a primary partner? What if I just want to be me and have other relationships? They hear that and they're like, oh, and they look into it. And now there's this incredible rich community that has grown around this identity label, this practice of relationships. And it's really interesting to kind of explore that together. And everyone's got a slightly different definition of it. Everybody's got a slightly different take on what it means for them. But I think because we're a community of people who are solo, we've created a space where it's like, it can be what it is for you. There's a few qualifiers that were, if you don't match that, we might question it, but like, it's your own experience of it.
I love that. I really love that. And just to rewind a little bit, so when we were talking about the definition of honest non-monogamy and all the different types of non-monogamy, and you were talking about how, one form of non-monogamy is dishonest non-monogamy, which is cheating, and the reason it's cheating is dishonesty. So let's talk about cheating in honest non-monogamy or in polyamory, because I think there is this idea that, oh, because everyone can just do whatever they like, there are no rules, no one can hurt each other, no one gets jealous, no one cheats on each other, it's a free-for-all, it's totally anarchic. And that's not the reality, at least not in my experience. So let's talk about that.
Oh, I think I'm going to cry just thinking, because I love that you asked that question. And it's a question that I don't think gets examined enough. There is something about, I take a trauma-informed approach to this work. And to me, that's about how are we caring for our nervous system? And so our nervous system relies on what do we know about the space around us to ascertain how safe am I? And so it's not just, looking around, there's no tigers that are going to jump out at me. It's also because we have this intellect in our brain, knowing intellectually what else is going on around us. And so anytime there's anything that has been concealed or withheld, and then we discover the truth, the brain kind of goes through this like, oh my God, this is an unknown variable I didn't expect. Was I actually as safe as I thought I was? So this is one of the aspects that happens when there has been dishonesty in non-monogamous relationships. Now, I think about, I can think of a couple of specific circumstances where I've seen cheating happen in poly situations. And I think in both of those circumstances, the person doing the cheating, what it looked like was that they were withholding. They were not being forthright. They were not being transparent in communication. And there's a lot of reasons why somebody might do that. And, we go back to that patriarchal monogamy stuff that we've all internalized. And there's a sense of shame of like, maybe I'm not allowed to do something different. Or maybe if I tell my partner that I'm doing this thing, it's going to upset them. And then I'm going to have drama and repair work to have to do over here. And maybe the idea of doing that feels too overwhelming. And I'd rather avoid that. And so I'm just going to avoid telling them and I'm going to withhold. And I even think about, when I was married and I had an affair, I justified that as an ethical decision to myself because I decided that telling my husband would hurt him emotionally and that not telling him was the kinder thing. And I look back at that now and I'm like, oh my God, that was terrible. That was so terrible of me. And yet I see so many people doing a similar thing. We are very good as human beings. We're very good at finding reasons to justify the behaviors that we want to do, even when those behaviors are hurting other people. And so, I think of, you can cheat in polyamory by having sex with someone new and not telling your partners or not upholding the agreements you have with partners around that. And that's what it really boils down to, is like, what are your agreements? What are both the implicit and explicit understandings between you as partners? And it can get sticky sometimes because, creating relationship agreements happens over time and we aren't following a default template. If you're in a monogamous relationship, there's kind of a default template and set of assumptions around like, you're not going to go sleep with somebody else. But in polyamory, as you said, like there's that space of, yeah, I can like a kid in a candy store. I can have all the things. And yet we still need to be able to maintain kindness with our other partners. And so I think about, what is the kindest thing to do? Is it, and I think the kindest thing to do in all cases is to talk about it. And there are going to be mistakes. There are going to be times where it's like, actually, there wasn't an opportunity to talk to you about it before this happened, or I forgot to mention something that you probably want to know. These things happen because we're human and we're not perfect. What matters, though, is that we can do the repair work afterwards and have the conversations. And I think that's about coming back into a space of honesty, back into a space of integrity. And that's really scary because in monogamy world, if you cheat, if you break an agreement, that's it. It's over. The relationship is ended. And working to rebuild trust after any kind of betrayal is hard work. And working to rebuild trust after a betrayal in non-monogamy is very complex because we don't usually get the privilege of having a sort of exclusive space because we've got other relationships going on. And it's not kind to drop those other relationships just because one is needing support. So it gets complex. So, let's try and avoid that. Let's try and create structures for ourselves to be able to have conversations. And so a lot of that is around, how do we create safety with each other? Most of the time when I've seen cheating happen in polyamorous situations, there was something about the situation where the partner didn't feel safe enough to have the difficult conversation with the other person. And that's not a commentary on like they were afraid their partner was going to get mad or like they like they're an unsafe person. It's that internal experience of safety. And that could come from childhood traumas. It could come from past relationship traumas, or it could come from narratives that we get from the culture around us. But how we create and cultivate those spaces of safety together is so important, because it helps create the space where we can have the difficult conversations and talk about the stuff that's uncomfortable and possibly going to upset one another without things falling apart.
Mm. And there's so much in what you've just said. Like, I want to record. Well, luckily I am recording this. I just want to listen to that section again and again and again. But I think you've really summed up the importance of communication in all relationships, but especially in non-monogamous relationships. And that, you know, that just because it's an anarchic situation when you're not like following society's rules or any set of rigid rules, doesn't mean that there isn't respect of yourself and the people you're with. Doesn't mean that there's no agreements, that there's no guidelines, that there's no when you're going to do something that's hurting your partner. My first long-term relationship was monogamish, and I am someone, and I think I want to talk about this next, I'm someone who does believe I'm inherently non-monogamous, right? That's just part of who I am. I've tried monogamy and it really didn't work for me. And so in that monogamish relationship, I cheated on my partner very early on in our relationship, a few months in. And I was totally honest with them when I was on a trip, and when I returned, I told them straight away. And I felt really, really bad about hurting them. I could see they were hurting, but I didn't feel bad about sleeping with someone else. And one of the reasons I slept with this other person, ironically, the sex was actually quite bad, but the reason I did it was because I already knew that I'd crossed a line, that I'd like kind of cheated at this point, before I slept with this person, I hadn't kissed this person and I hadn't had sex with them. So in theory, by monogamous standards, I hadn't cheated, but we'd been really physically affectionate with each other. We'd been like emotionally intimate. I used to like sit on his lap with my arm around him. He'd like, kiss my neck. We spent all our time together. And so I felt like I had to have sex with him, just so that I could tell my partner that I cheated on them.
Wow.
Because if not, I'd go home and technically I hadn't done anything wrong, and then I had this thing to carry, and then like it felt like a bigger burden to. And I know this sounds like kind of distorted in some ways, but again, it's that thing of like a betrayal of trust. I'd already betrayed my partner's trust in the relationship I had with this person when I was on this trip. And so having sex with them just kind of made it cleaner. It made it like, I've cheated on you. I'm sorry. I love you. I still want to be in a relationship with you. I'm not going to see this person again. Whereas if I just come back from the trip with this kind of, oh, I had this connection with this person, but nothing happened. It was like,
Well, it makes a lot of sense that you would make that decision, because I mean, any kind of like emotional affair, there's question marks. There's a kind of ambiguity about, is this cheating or is this not? Because for some people they would count that as, for some people they wouldn't. But our nervous system craves a sense of certainty.
Mm-hmm.
And so rather than sit with the ambiguity of like, what am I doing here? Your nervous system was like, hey, let's do this. Let's actually create some certainty of like, okay, we did that. We broke the trust. And that's the thing. Our nervous system will sometimes make decisions like that. And I say nervous system because that includes the brain. The brain is making that decision based on what the body is telling it.
It's creating that box, that safety box of I've cheated on you, rather than that ambiguity of being beyond the boxes of like something happened and I explored a connection with a person, but and I think that's what I love about non-monogamy, is that I feel like I can just explore a connection and I never have to make a decision about whether I have sex or don't have sex based on anything other than whether I want to have sex or not have sex with that person in that moment, and then whether that person or those people want to with me. It's like I can explore and I can get as intimate with someone as I like, regardless of whether I'm dating anyone else or not at the time. And there's never that pressure to suddenly put a relationship in a box, to make things, okay, this is a sexual relationship, this is a romantic, this is a friendship, this is platonic, this is a combination of whichever ones. It's like, again, it's describing, like I have, people sometimes ask me how many partners you have. And sometimes that's easy to answer, but a lot of the times it's not, because it's like, what do you mean by that? Do you mean how many people am I regularly having sex with? Do you mean how many people am I like emotionally invested in? Do you mean like, what do you mean? Do you mean, and then what does regularly count as? Because, you know, I have people that I have partners who live in different continents. So what does that mean?
Yep. Yeah, I have a same difficulty answering that question. I'm like, how are you defining partner? Let's talk about that. What you were saying just there, it was reminding me as well, like, you know, people in monogamy, we think of cheating as just being about sexual infidelity. And I think and it's not, but in non-monogamy, I think there's so many other ways that we might cheat. And I think it boils down to, are you honoring the agreements? Are you respecting the integrity of what you've created in a connection as you are creating other connections? You know, one example that comes to mind, I know somebody who was getting ready to move to another province to be with a partner, and that other partner hadn't been transparent in like communicating how often their other partner was over, and that their other partner locally to them had like a bunch of stuff at their house and like all these other things. So, you know, there's a withholding there, and there is a kind of betrayal there, because, you know, this person who has this home and is like about to welcome a new partner moving in with them has another person kind of half living there, but hasn't communicated that to the other person.
Right.
And so are they honoring the integrity of what it is that they are creating? And it goes back to that consent piece. This person over here doesn't actually have the full information. They've assumed that their partner will tell them. And all they've heard is, oh, yeah, you know, my other girlfriend keeps a change of clothes here. But it turns out to be like, actually, they have a whole wardrobe of clothes or something like that. And so when we talk about cheating and non-monogamy, it's not just about the sexual fidelity piece. It's about the how are we honoring the integrity of each relationship in relationship to one another. And anytime that we aren't, that we are kind of dropping that ball or withholding or even telling half truths rather than whole truths, I think that could fall under a category of cheating.
Yeah, 100%. And I think that's true of monogamy and non-monogamy, or of non-monogamy and monogamy. And, you know, I think there's a few really important points you're making there around like honoring the integrity of each relationship, of like agreements that are implicit as well as explicit, and factoring in intention and impact, right? And you need to hold both. So there's like, whether you're, you know, you might do something and you're not intending to hurt your partner or partners or anyone you care about, but you might know you have to factor in the impact it's going to have. And again, that might be because of their own implicit trauma and their own past experience and stuff. But if you know that you have a partner who is really insecure about like a certain thing, and you just go and do the thing being like, well, you know, to me, it doesn't mean anything. It's like, yes, but if you know that to them, it's going to hurt them, then you have to factor that in. You have to factor in your own intention, the intention of the act, and the impact it's having on other people. And that's so true on so many different levels and different areas of life.
Well, and in what you're talking about, I'm thinking about like, what are the tools that have helped me in those situations? And, you know, in Wheel of Consent, which is a wonderful framework for looking at consent created by Betty Martin, one of the key questions you ask is, who is this for? Right? Who is this for? Who am I doing this for? So when we're like acting things out in our relationships, who are we doing it for? Are we doing it because we want to please another partner? Are we doing it for our own needs? Are we doing it you know, because society told us that's what we're supposed to do? And then you look at NVC, nonviolent communication or compassionate communication. One of the key questions you get asked in that to consider is, what do I need? And so we learn how to talk about our needs and express our needs and listen to each other's needs. I think in non-monogamy, the question that we need to ask more often is, why am I doing this? Why am I making these choices? Why am I acting in this way? Because that can help shift the focus onto, is this something that I'm doing because I am holding back? Is it something that's coming from that old patriarchal monogamy hangover stuff that's hanging out in the back here? Is it something that I'm doing because I'm trying to hide something from another partner? Why am I doing what I'm doing? And even looking at non-monogamy itself, why am I doing non-monogamy? It's absolutely possible to pursue non-monogamy as a form of avoidance or dissociation. But why? Why are you doing that? And you can pursue non-monogamy initially as a form of dissociation or avoidance, but it could also be authentic to who you are. So, finding the motivations that have integrity, that are authentic, that are embodied, rather than the ones that are coming from your shadow side, is, I think, really important.
That's great. A great piece of advice. I don't know if it's quite advice, but it's a great piece to bring in. Thank you. And it leads me perfectly into the next point, which is so we've touched upon this a little bit already, but is non-monogamy, polyamory, honest non-monogamy, whatever we want to call it, do you believe, an inherent identity? Is it like one's sexual orientation, or is it a lifestyle choice? And I have lots of thoughts on it because I spend a lot of time thinking about it, but I want to hear yours first.
Yeah, I think there is probably a spectrum of fidelity to promiscuity that everyone's got inherently wired. And when it comes to that, we've got a choice about how we do that.
Right.
So you can be non-monogamous, you can be wired to have multiple partners, and that's what you're craving authentically. I look at my childhood, like I was definitely looking for that from an early age. But how you go about doing that is the choice. So you have the choice to do that dishonestly. You have the choice to do that honestly. You, even within the choice of honesty, you have the options of, do I want that to look like having multiple partners in a committed pod? Do I want it to look like swinging? Do I want it to look like being a free agent and being solo and having multiple different partners and having long distance lovers, right? Like there's so many different options of how you go about doing non-monogamy in an honest way. So I think it's both. It's, there's an element of it where, yes, this is an inherent orientation, and there's an element of it where we have a choice about how we go about pursuing that. My cat just came in to sit down. I just want to acknowledge he's wearing his little rainbow sweater.
He's very cute with his rainbow sweater. No, I think that's really interesting. And I think, the honesty starts with oneself. And I think that that's sometimes where people go wrong. It's not that they're intentionally deceiving others, it's that they're lying to themselves. And I've definitely been there myself about my, why. And so that's why it's so important to ask that question again and again of why. Why am I doing this? Who am I doing this for? And yeah. So, and I like what you're saying about the elements of it being both. Personally feel like, when as for an inherent identity, I think some people are wired to be non-monogamous. I think I'm definitely one of those people. From what you've said, I think you're one of those people. I think some people are definitely wired to be monogamous. I have my best friend, she lived with me and saw me exploring polyamory. She's super open-minded. She's read all the books. She's just it's not for me.
Yeah.
And yet there are some elements of polyamory that she has adopted, her and I are in some ways each other's primary partners to some degree, not quite, but she's my best friend, and we're two very important people to each other. So whether we have romantic partners or sexual partners or not, we try and prioritize our relationship. And we just had a chat because she's just dating someone new, and I was feeling a little insecure about that because she is monogamous, and last time she had a long-term partner, it did impact our relationship, but we had a whole conversation about that. And again, we communicate about our relationship and what we mean to each other and our expectations, which in some ways is a form of, non-monogamy, in the sense that it's what often is expected of romantic partners rather than
Yeah.
friendships, for example.
Well,
And
and
then
that kind of reminds me of like in relationship anarchy, relationship anarchy doesn't necessarily mean that it's going to lead you to polyamory or non-monogamous relationships sexually. People can be monogamous and be a relationship anarchist and
yeah,
have platonic partnerships that they are prioritizing. And I love the idea of having platonic life partners. I've definitely got people in my life. I'm like, you're one of my platonic partners in my life. Like you are, I want you around, and we're working on how do we do that? What does that mean to have a platonic commitment to each other?
100%. And I think that's another thing that just gets overlooked by society because, there's so much emphasis on like monogamous, romantic, traditional relationships. But that's a whole other topic that we could spend another hour talking about. And I'm aware of time. So I was just going to finish off. And I think that's for some people, it's much more for choice. I think I call them the bisexuals of non-monogamy or the switches of non-monogamy, and one of my partners, they really they had a 5 or 6 year monogamous relationship where they got engaged and they were super content. Now they're doing sort of non-monogamy with me, and they're also just sort of casually dating other people. So that's again something I wanted to ask about, but I don't think we have time today. But about casual dating and how that fits in with things when people date multiple people but still identify as monogamous or whatever. But I like the idea that that there's a spectrum of identity, a spectrum of like whether people want one or multiple partners or zero partners at all. For some people are very happy either because they're aromantic or asexual or celibate or a combination.
Yeah.
And then there's a choice of how to do that and the importance of honesty in that.
Yeah, and I think there are people who are flexible with it. I've found that too, and it really depends on where they're at in their life or who they're with. And there are some people who do explore non-monogamy, and then one day they find somebody and they're like, actually, I think I just want to date you, and that's totally fine. There shouldn't be any shame around that. I think we have to, and I think this goes back to the anarchy piece. Like we have to have permission to change what we're doing, and that's the agency, that's the sovereignty. I mean, I have people come into my course and they will be like, I don't know what I want to do. Maybe I want non-monogamy, maybe I want monogamy. And they come out of it perhaps saying like, actually, yeah, what I want is monogamy. I just don't want it to look like the traditional patriarchal nuclear family kind of monogamy. I want it to look like my own version of monogamy.
Yeah.
And I think that's great. And I think we need more of that in the world.
100%, 100%. So tell us a little bit more about your monogamy detox course.
So the Monogamy Detox course is a lifetime access course that I created to help people unpack all those pieces around patriarchal monogamy and what I call the Monogamy Hangover. I run it live twice a year, so it runs for 6 weeks, but you have lifetime access because, like I said, we can't undo patriarchal programming in 6 weeks flat. I wish we could, but that means that every time the course runs again, you can repeat it and you have ongoing access to the materials. So it runs every spring and fall. And I love teaching it. Like I've had over 200 people go through the course now, and it's so beautiful to see what happens in their lives and the transformations that they go through. And I mean, all walks of life. I've had people who were there because they're coming out of purity culture, and I have people who are there because they're in training for religious seminary and they wanted to question their core beliefs. And there are people in their 70s and there are people in their early 20s. Like it's all different ages. It's really, really incredible to see who shows up for that work.
Brilliant. And so for people who are starting out with non-monogamy, do you have any advice, any tips, anything that you would suggest?
Yeah. So if you're starting out in non-monogamy, the three questions that I encourage people to ask are, what kind of non-monogamy do you want to explore? Then that important question of why? Why are you doing this? Why do you want that? And the third question is, where do you want it to go? Like, do you have a vision, even if it's just a rough sketch of where you want it to be 5 or 10 years from now? And find the answers to those questions for yourself and then start asking those questions of other people. I think that is really, really important to start off with. And don't do it alone. You have to resource yourself. It's so valuable to have a community of peers. people who are non-monogamous who you're not dating that you can reach out to for support when you need it. Get a good therapist or counselor. Look for the coaches and elders that can support you. And also when you bump up against your trauma stuff, do the trauma work, right? Don't let yourself get disconnected from your body and just become a walking head doing non-monogamy, which is, it's amazing how easy it is to just fall into that. Really keep yourself in your body as you go through it.
Fantastic. And do you have any tips, advice for people who have a family member or a loved one who's just come out as non-monogamous, and how to be supportive to them?
I think be kind to them, please. You know, it is a journey, and it's not necessarily going to be a smooth road. I think for anybody who's exploring things in a counter-normative way, there are bumps in that road, and it is so much easier when you have the support of family, rather than feeling like your family becomes another bump in that road. If you have a family member or loved one who is exploring non-monogamy, you can support them by doing reading and learning terms. I think, you know, we've talked about Meg-John's work. I adore Meg-John's work. I think
Me
what
too.
they're doing is phenomenal and like revolutionary. And I think also the way that they write is super clear. And so you can read some of their articles, I think, to get a primer on even just questioning your own thinking to help you be able to engage with your loved one in conversations about it. And don't get too worried if your loved one is having a rough time. That rough time is not necessarily about non-monogamy. It could, you know, we have rough times in all different kinds of relationships. So that's one thing I notice is people are quick to blame the non-monogamy for relationship problems when relationship problems happen in monogamous relationships too. So yeah, don't make non-monogamy the boogeyman. It's it sometimes it could be part of it, but it's not necessarily. So keeping that open mind, I think, is really important.
And I think that's so important, that non-monogamy isn't the issue, and also that you can have abusive or complicated or toxic relationships come up in all relationship forms, whether they're monogamous or non-monogamous. And we talk again about that on the Trauma Super Conference. So listeners, go check that out. And finally, well, not quite finally, I have a couple more questions, but one is, as we're talking about support and allyship, what's a way that you feel you are supportive or an ally to communities that are marginalized or oppressed that you are not a part of?
That's a really, really good question. You know, I'm part of the queer community, and then I sit in this weird, ambiguous space when it comes to racial identities, because you know, my matrilineal ancestors are Sinti, and that's a minority that not many people know who they are, especially in North America. And so I have my own lived experience of experiencing marginalization, of seeing my mother harassed at borders and things like that. But that's not the same as people who are Black in North America, or people who are Indigenous in North America. And so you know, I can only do what I can do, and that is to learn and to listen. And one of the things that I've discovered is that it's really important to not, to know where I can speak and to know where I can't speak, and to be able to direct people to the resources that might be more culturally appropriate for them. I think that's really, really important. So I want to honor my limitations in that. Having said that, I'm really passionate about decolonizing intimate spaces. And so I read a lot. I love Dr. Kim Tallbear, who writes the blog, The Critical Polyamorist. And, you know, what she writes about is a very, very necessary critique. And, you know, she's talking about the Indigenous experience, but I think everybody can benefit from that, because it helps us see the impact of colonialism on our relationships, not just if you're Indigenous, but like no matter what your background is, there is an impact that colonialism has had on your relationship spaces. And I think that can be a really important seed for that questioning. Did I answer your question
You
there?
did, you did.
Okay,
I
good.
love that you're doing your own work around that, and that you're, amplifying voices when you recognize your own limitations, so that you're not doing the saviorism piece, but more supporting where you can, speaking out when it's important, and knowing your limitations and amplifying other people's voices or pointing to other resources when you come to those. Um, what are some key bits that you've learned from non-monogamy that you think people who are listening who are monogamous that you'd like to share with them that you feel like they could learn from non-monogamy? Like do you have any tidbits, any
I
pépites,
think
as we
that
say in French?
I think the number one thing is the communication. In monogamy, we kind of default. That was my experience in my monogamous marriage, and I've seen that with a lot of other people. We just default, we autopilot onto this relationship escalator, and we don't question what's going on. And it can feel really scary to experience conflict because we recognize conflict as being this destabilizing force that's going to pull everything apart. And I think what non-monogamy embraces, with like more explicit communication, having more processes for sitting down and working through conflict together, doing repair work, doing accountability work, I think these are all very valuable skills that don't have to only exist in the field of non-monogamy. Like, can you imagine like having a monogamous relationship and doing conscious work on it, and talking about conflict and having regular check-ins with your partner, and not just falling into a complacency of like, well, this is what we do now. And I think that's really valuable. Another thing that I think non-monogamy offers the space for is, exploring your sexuality in a diverse form of ways, right? Because every partner that you date brings something else out on you, even if you're only dating people of the same genders. But in a monogamous relationship, it can be really good to get outside of your own routine in terms of like, how do you experience your eroticism? How do you experience sensuality? How do you come into that space together? One of the number one complaints that people have in their monogamous relationships is that they're kind of bored of their sex life and they want to spice things up. And I think non-monogamy can offer tools for exploring that. And it doesn't have to look like you have to go sleep with somebody else. It could look like going to a sex party and just watching other people have sex, right? It could look like taking workshops. And, a lot of sexuality educators and workshops have come out of non-monogamous spaces. So the monogamous community gets to benefit from those a lot too.
Fantastic. And finally, Mel Cassidy, how do you go beyond boxes?
Oh, I don't even know what a box is anymore.
I think Meg-John said the exact same thing at the end. I don't think it made it into the final cut of the interview, but I'm pretty sure they were like, I don't think I'm in any boxes anymore. I love that. The best kind of people have gone fully beyond boxes.
It really is. I mean, when I have conversations with people who are very, very new to this, it's a reality check for me of like, whoa, right, this is still how most of the world learns things and sees things. And I didn't ever think that I would become this bohemian queer radical, but it turns out that I have. And I think I've kind of gotten used to that. Like the constant in my life is the challenging of boxes. And there's a somatic experience for me when I feel like someone's trying to put me in a box. Like I can feel my back tense up, and there's this like shuddering sensation. And that's always an indicator for me of like, okay, I need to do something different. I want to change things up. And that's about challenging myself in new ways. And so being a lifelong student, learning new skills. One of the things this year I've been doing is getting back into singing, and I bought myself a bendier drum so I can just practice doing vocals by myself. And it's like, I'm not going to just get complacent and conform to one way of being. I'm going to continuously keep expanding myself in new avenues and new directions.
Ah, fantastic. I love that you say the one constant you have is challenging the norms, challenging the boxes. That's such a great answer. Mel, how can people find out more about you and your work?
So you can find me on social media on Instagram and Facebook at Radical Relating. My main website is radicalrelationshipcoaching.ca. And you can also find more about the Monogamy Detox course at monogamydetox.com.
Fantastic. Thank you so, so much for your time today. I've loved this conversation and I feel like we could talk for hours, but hopefully we'll have other opportunities to do just that.
Thank you so much.